not governed by the promise of an afterlife or the inability, or was it about the inability of the Mormon faith to adequately grasp the meaning of family, especially in light of the meaning of sealings? His faith was not governed by historical inconsistencies, by debates on the Trinity or the nature of God, or on notions of grace and works, and so forth. Rather, his faith in the Mormon Church thrived on what it could add and complete in what he already believed and practiced as a Navajo spiritual leader. What mattered to him was the Book of Mormon allowing him to be indigenous, even if his faith in being an Israelite was not complete. His faith was both loyal and an act of resistance. There are several modes of resistance that emerge from indigenous communities. Despite a church with a mythology designed to replace indigenous people, they resisted in significant but marginal ways. I don't know, can I say that? Significantly marginal? So passive non-compliance becomes a key mode of resistance and an act of faith within indigenous communities and their membership in the church. It is about recentering power. The biopolitical power of the church attempts to structure and dictate what is and is not culturally appropriate for an indigenous member of the church. For example, church leaders swiftly reprimand indigenous people for attending Native ceremony. Yet Native church members still participate, because for them it expands the central doctrines of the church around eternal connectedness or family. This is the church's obsession with individuality and individuality's limited ability to understand the meaning of family in the context of the sealing. Ceremony provides the central core meaning that's missing from the lexicon of the church. As the notion of individualism is ultimately about, as well, upholding one of the tenets of whiteness. Thus, indigenous people continue to participate in their own ceremony because for them it is about expanding the meaning of church doctrine and their proximity to the core purposes of the Book of Mormon. Thus, this mode of resistance, this passive non-compliance, is premised on their faith in the Book of Mormon. And that becomes a central paradox, is the Book of Mormon allows them to get in touch with their own indigeneity and allows them to get closer to the core purposes of the Book of Mormon. Well, that is often viewed as a deviation from the central logic of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint. And you have these two things functioning. And so faith becomes an act of resistance. And so the blossoming, I'll conclude with this, the blossoming is controlled and strictly guarded by the church.
Of those Navajos who did enroll in such programs. Each year, Mormon missionaries assigned to the Southwest Indian Mission recruited children for Indian Seminary and Indian Student Placement Program. The latter eventually enrolled some 50,000 Indian children, mostly Navajos, and placed them in LDS foster homes during the school months. Some withdrew, others enrolled year after year. The church organized monthly Indian activities and leadership training that culminated in the annual Lamanite Conference, which recognized those who demonstrated strong academic and spiritual success, the latter defined in LDS terms, of course. And when these Navajo Mormons returned to their reservations in the summers and after graduation, what did other Navajos think of them? Before I give you some data that might answer that question, I think it's important to note how the Navajo Nation was changing at the same time. The reservation underwent a socio-economic revolution. Seasonally inaccessible dirt roads and a barter economy gave way during the 1950s to 300 miles of bridges and highways and another 350 miles of granite roads, crushed granite roads. Extractive industries from petroleum and coal and uranium produced a cash economy. The roads and wages introduced outside products and values during the 1960s and 1970s. In the mid-1970s, one Dene elder recalled with some awe that, quote, "We have grocery stores filled with food, clothing markets full of clothes, and other shops equipped with whatever we wish to purchase." The Navajo Times increasingly advertised household appliances, credit cards, automobiles, all reflecting an unprecedented expansion of Navajo wages and purchasing power. Beginning in the late 1970s, shopping malls arose in Window Rock, Tuba City, Chinle, Kayenta, and by the close of the decade, the annual tribal fair divided the prestigious princess title into two categories, Miss Traditional Navajo and Miss Modern Navajo. Many community elders expressed horror over what they perceived as cultural loss. In the preface to his 1977 collection of autobiographical sketches, one historian observed that, quote, elders feel that undesirable traits may have been acquired through contact with the dominant society and through television, modern literature, and a generally low quality of cinema, end quote. In interview after interview, tribal elders cited declining family values and the deterioration of extended clan relationships. Essentially, they resented the reckless individualism and characterized that critique as cultural loss. They saw Western values as unwanted intruders that produced defiant children, sexual promiscuity, religious defection, and language loss. Dirt floor hogans could no longer suffice the new generation. They wanted, quote, soft beds, clean clothes, plenty of water, and electricity. As the Navajo Nation transformed, broader changes also swept Native people nationwide. War industry jobs, followed by 1950s federal termination and urbanization efforts, relocated many Natives to city centers. And by 1970, about half of Native Americans lived off of reservations. There, they built in cities intertribal connections that spawned a new movement, Red Power. These urban Indians joined in a variety of organizations that adopted more confrontational, media-centered tactics. They succeeded in winning national attention, vital legislation, but older reservation Indians often viewed them with some suspicion. It is in these changing contexts that the LDS Indian Program graduates began to come of age. Youth and teens who participated in the placement program certainly learned new ideas far beyond what their parents anticipated them when volunteering their children for education. How did those children fare upon their return to the reservation each summer or after graduation? The church had the same question, and it hired an outside contractor to conduct a large survey that ultimately received 783 respondents, including a few child participants and tribal leaders, but primarily focused on parents, most of whom were not LDS. The report was never intended for outside use, which I think adds some to its credibility, though we might speculate a greater likelihood of response from those with more positive views. Nevertheless, it found that 95% of parents had a good or very good attitude about placement, as did 92% of current students and 81% of former students. 78% of parents and 63% of tribal leaders said that placement made their children stronger tribal members. The report also demonstrated that tribal leaders, parents, and students believed that participants fit well and that it was not harmful to their identity. Listeners today might be suspicious of those results. In the growing age of activism, many outsiders also grew skeptical of the placement program. In 1976, the Interstate Commerce Administration, which oversaw child placements across state lines, directed its South Dakota director to survey placement program participants. He, too, expected to find more critical attitudes, but instead found, quote, no sense from any of the respondents that they were not satisfied with the program as it was being administered presently by the LDS Church. A shocking 70% said that they felt LDS foster families helped their Indian children better understand their identity with their native heritage. This can't be right. It is tempting to assume the data must be flawed, that it must somehow be selective. Perhaps it is. But there's also a problem here that stems from this desire to reject the data because of a false notion of oppressors and resistors, when in fact there's a much more complex phenomenon happening in between. The most famous self-identified Lamanite, George Peele, wrote, quote, "Words cannot describe the sweetness, the warmth, the tremendous impressions that the Spirit made upon me when I realized that God loved my people, the Indian people, that God loved me as an Indian." He frequently gushed about the blessings of the gospel. To imply this feeling was universal, because I have just as many quotes from former participants expressing frustration, resentment, sadness, or hostility towards the church for cultural genocide. Many former participants carry around elements of all of those feelings. The key to understanding this is to accept the full spectrum of possible responses and then to begin picking apart the gradations in between to see how different people define their Indianness in the changing context. Many former placement program children went on to BYU, and there they sparred with each other and outsiders about the very meaning of a Lamanite. Self-proclaimed Lamanites tended to discount communal efforts in favor of individualism. They usually advocated conservative reform by working within the system and faulted Red Power activists for their non-traditional and sensationalist methods. When the American Indian movement leaders visited BYU in the 1970s, they were run off by Native women at the Y. Miss Nora Mae Begay, former placement program participant, and Miss Indian BYU and Miss Indian America, explained, quote, "The militant movements are disgracing to the Indian heritage." This cleavage between self-identified Lamanites and Red Power activists is interesting. Both groups vied for authenticity of their own new pan-Indian movement. When Clyde Warrior served as president of the National Indian Youth Council, he famously authored an essay assessing 5 types of fake Indians. He identified Slavs, jokers, these are his words, ultra-pseudo-Indians, angry nationalists, and sellouts. Another activist, Lehman Brightman, frequently denounced non-activist Indians, even his elders, as Uncle Tomahawks. In this changing context of competing identities, one former placement student asked, "What is being Indian?" He went on to explain that, quote, "There are no rules." This particular student rejected the American Indian movement model of Indianness and said, quote, who are they to say that they are the teachers of the Indian people?" But Indians at BYU were far from united themselves, at least during the 1960s, when repeated clashes over Indian dances divided the student population. Paul Felt, director of Indian programs at BYU, in 1966 struck down the dances from the annual Indian Week festivities. Students appealed to President Wilkinson, and he restored the dances. But over the following years, BYU Indian student leaders increasingly took aim at the activity. In one meeting, then graduate student John Rayner of Pueblo expressed concern that, quote, "The Lamanite student is being shackled by the old identity. We are not that anymore," end quote. Now, less correlated Lamanites continue to practice their dances and debated true Indianness at BYU. Victor Salem attended the Y in the early 1970s and tested the dress code with his long hair. He grew angry when organizers rejected his Red Power panel proposal for Indian Week. And after expulsion, he declared that BYU was full of, quote, "apples," red-skinned Indians with white on the inside. And then there is Stanley Snake, who both attended BYU and served as president of the National Indian Youth Council that gave birth to the Red Power movement. He commented that, quote, "I've had to answer questions about the Mormon church, and at the same time I've had to answer the Mormons about why I'm a member of NIYC, which some consider to be militant," end quote. He said that he thought of himself as, quote, "a buffer between the Mormon church and certain segments of the Red Power movement." So what are we to do with this? Some Indians rejected the Lamanite identity, pitched by missionaries and foster parents. Others embraced it as a source of strength, even those competed among themselves year after year about just what a Lamanite meant and what was an Indian, that equally broke with tradition and established a geographically boundless pan-Indian identity. Neither fit within the old traditions of the 1950s, but those traditions had given way to more modern ideas anyhow. None of them, not the Lamanites, not the Red Power activists, or even the modern Navajos, could ever really return to decades earlier because that home space too had changed. So it's complicated. What do we make of all of them? I really don't know. And I dare not speak too far on their behalf. But I will return to the words of Thomas Wolfe, whose book I introduced at the introduction, and his fictional tale of the gentleman that's traveling the world and his difficulties. At the close of that novel, the main character finally realizes the complexity of his situation. He says, quote, "He knew now, as he had never known before, the priceless measure of his loss. He also knew the priceless measure of his gain. He was out, and being out, there was no road back." And so it is with the Lamanites created in the mid to late 20th century. Many still are among us today. Some take great pride in their Lamanite status, others despise it as an emblem of assimilation, but most bear a mixed attitude, complicated by overlapping feelings of loss and gain, and that's why their story is so worth telling. Thank you.
So we have some time for some questions, if anybody has one. We would ask that you use a microphone. A mic person somewhere. Yes.
Oh,
Looks like it's not gonna go.
I was gonna just ask him. Sorry.
Do you want to come up here
Oh.
for now and ask your
Sure.
question? I'm sorry. We usually have a wireless mic up here, but
I just wanted to ask you, how do you see similarities or connections, if you do, to from what was happening with the Red Power movement to perhaps the activism going on now and the groups with Standing Rock and Keystone Pipeline and whatnot? And that might be, on the nose question, but if you do see connections, how?
Sure. So that's moving a little bit away from the Mormon studies topic, but I think a valuable question, right? How is it similar or different? In the 1970s, we really had this big flare-up of these occupations and media spectacles that really died down by the end of the decade and through the 80s and 90s. And while Native people continue to assert their role and their place and fight for a place in American society, they often worked more within the system. They worked on the reservations. And it's really kind of a renaissance of this older 1970s model now to see with the pipeline and other more visible protests that they kind of were quiet for a little while. So that is hailing back to that 1970s sort of style that we seem to have seen kind of disappear for a little while. There is a parallel.
Can I also address that? I actually gave a talk on Standing Rock and Mormonism not too long ago. And one of the things that I find significant about the connection and its connection to Mormonism is this cultural revival piece, especially among Native Mormons. The connecting to this notion that that water is indeed life. There is this feeling of cultural revival among a lot of, at least in my community, Navajo community, and other indigenous communities among the Mormons, where before that it seemed to transgress the basic notions of what it meant to be a Mormon, to connect with this cultural saying that water is life, because it seemed to violate some of these basic principles of Mormonism. But because of this cultural revival, they were able to then connect back and see that it did not indeed violate any of these Mormon precepts, but rather it actually strengthened and expanded their notions of what life meant, and expanded for them these notions of relationality and what that meant to the Mormon notion of family. And so for them, they began to really see that all things are related. And for them, it also expanded this notion of what it meant to be family, what family meant in the Mormon context. And so they went out and started to reconnect with that cultural part of that undergirded Standing Rock. The Standing Rock in the beginning was essentially a struggle over the spiritual, because the historical preservation officer was fighting with the archaeologists from the Army Corps of Engineers over defining what was a sacred site. And that then, take what you get for that, but that's where I see the connection. And a lot of that stemmed from, that activism stemmed from the Red Power movement and before.
I found the mic, Christian. It was right in front of me.
Thank you both, Matthew and Moroni. I just have a question for Moroni. I'm wondering what his response would be to Matthew's address as Dene.
I think in the end that reflections, at least in the conversations I've had and the observations I've had with many members of the church, reflections on the placement program, and you've probably heard this before. It was bad for my family. It took away from there, but then they also say, but it was also bad for the nation in these ways. And so at least in my understanding of this, at least I would argue that the placement program, while good for some individuals, was ultimately destructive to the sovereign status of tribes and their ability to articulate for themselves what it meant to be Mormon. And even now, we're constantly in this struggle. My father's a branch president back home, and when I go home, there are these constant tensions of feeling Navajo but feeling left out, and those who were not converted through traditional means, through missionaries or white people like my family was, we stand at odds with a lot of other Navajo Mormons who had this interaction with the white Mormon church during the conversion process. And so it's completely foreign to us of their affiliation and loyalty to the whiteness of the church. And oftentimes that becomes, because this whole notion of the placement program is just, it's foreign to our family. And according to my grandfather, destructive to this notion of, to the Navajo notion of kinship. He calls it Kahwinson, or what they call, and he's always talking to, and he used to always talk about how he said Kahwinastit, meaning that family is tied to everything, and when there is a force that disrupts that connection, it is never good. And I think beginning now that's how I would respond to these reflections on the placement program, that it was an essentially it was an apparatus of the Mormon church to, in my mind, as a means to reconfigure the Native person as a means of deflecting and complicity in all sorts of colonial havoc that they perpetuated on Native people and continue to perpetuate on Native people. Anyways, I don't know if that was a response, but.
I can't speak directly to the placement program, but some similarities sort of came to my mind in terms of Latinos who came to BYU and then go home. And I remember as a bishop confronting the reality that those who had come to BYU, and there was just a few of them, but they were spread out through the branches and wards, that they came in sort of as gatekeepers, that they were the ones who sort of tried to create this structure of what Mormonism needed to be even within the Latino community, found themselves normally disliked to an extent, because they were never seen, even though they brought in this idea of being a Latino Latter-day Saint, it seemed in many ways to be kind of an outsider's view and approach. Do these Indians in the placement program, these Lamanites, do they also become gatekeepers? Do they also create parameters? Do they also then begin to judge the people as to whether they are good Mormons and good Lamanite Mormons? And that's of interest to me because of the Latino experience.
Yeah, I think that's a very apt characterization of what's going on with Native Americans at BYU as well. There's, of course, a wide spectrum of participants that may not fit that description, but there are those who are being prized and valued at Lamanite conferences for their poems about how they're good Lamanites and that are speaking the party line, right? Those are advanced into leadership. Those are the ones who are going to play that same role that you're describing. Like the gentleman I quoted from John Rayner that ended up becoming a professor at BYU later. Yes, there's definitely that segment. And I think that there's definitely a tension between them and maybe many of the others who don't quite want to come along that far, who don't want to fully internalize all of these elements of this colonized trope of the Lamanite. And so, yeah, there's definitely a clash. And that's the place where I would like to focus. What I think is, and I'm moving more in that direction. I think that would be the most fascinating part is when you have intergroup tensions and there's that spectrum of along the colonized path, the colonized ideal that the Mormon Church has laid out for them, and different people along different places there are competing with each other about what's the correct place, right? What's a good, true Lamanite? And of course, the church is playing a role in publishing poems and in promoting and endorsing those who are closer to the official policy. So that complicates their relationship because now it's not just Indians competing, it's Indians competing with the Mormon Church endorsing one faction. But I think it makes a fascinating issue, a complex issue of identity. Yeah.
I think there definitely are some gatekeepers, and I think that the emphasis on the Lamanite is probably maybe a decade old. I think most people will prefer the term children of Father Lehi in some contexts, and that's really a reclaiming of what they feel is their rightful place. But Native communities over time, up to this point, is the rhetoric of the church has become very flat when it starts to talk about diversity. It begins to emphasize just the Latter-day Saint, as if though but we have to unpack what that means. The Latter-day Saint is a good, worthy white male. I mean, in its truthfulness. And so there is no longer an emphasis on what a good Navajo is or what a worthy one is. It's like, you will be the good Latter-day Saint. And the implication being is those who live by that logic are therefore worthy. And so if my grandfather were alive today, he passed away in 1987, he would be deemed, given his view of the church, a rebel. I mean, he would have to be reprimanded for what he did and how he lived the Mormon faith, because he was not living a life consonant with that notion of the Latter-day Saint, the worthy Latter-day Saint. And so now we have gatekeepers of a different kind. They're no longer attempting to articulate what it means to be a good Navajo. They're attempting to articulate within our own communities what it means to be a good Mormon and to adopt and abide by this logic of the Latter-day Saint. And so now there's different gatekeepers of indigeneity, which often operate outside of the church. But then it brings up all sorts of other questions, because you then have those members in the church who are like, well, I'm still Navajo. Who am I fighting with now? I'm now with the Latter-day Saint, who's the person who went on the placement program, who's also feeling this erasure from the Mormon Church by no longer acknowledging them as indigenous. And so now you now have these strange oddfellows of okay, before we were in this